most people would be familiar with the term food insecurity. But could you give us an overview, a kind of a description for people who may not be familiar with the term?
So food insecurity is inadequate access to food of the type and quality needed to fuel a healthy and active lifestyle.
Where would you find this kind of a situation? Are there certain areas of the country? Is it more of an urban problem? Is it more of a rural problem, or is it pretty much widespread?
Food insecurity is more concentrated among low-income households, which are spread disproportionately across the country. So there are more low-income households in the South. There are more low-income households in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. So there are concentrations of low-income households where food insecurity is disproportionately represented. But food insecurity, I think, interestingly, is not uncommon among non-low-income households. So there are middle and upper income families who can experience food insecurity. And that's actually what partly drew me to the research area.
What are some of the reasons?
I was still in graduate school at the time. I was living in New York, and I was watching the news, and there was a news story that was, they were filming live outside of a food pantry in New Jersey, which is, a close community to Manhattan. And it was a wealthy enclave of New Jersey where many of the household earners commuted into Manhattan with big jobs earning lots of money. And this red Mercedes pulled into the driveway of the food bank while the reporter was filming the story. And you saw the reporter cut away and then later say, and the person's face was blurred out, you seem to have a very expensive car. What are you doing here getting food? And the person, who happened to be a mother, said, I lost my job. We own our house in this very expensive neighborhood. We want to keep up appearances. We don't want to have to pull our children out of school. And so the first thing that we cut was our food budget, because that seemed like we could make that up elsewhere. And I thought that was really interesting, that it's like, in some cases the first thing to go, in some cases the last thing to go. It's something that parents think is, fluid, that they can make up for, and they don't want to give up their, at least in the upper income, their status, and they don't want to create instability in their family. So pulling your kid out of school is viewed as, at least by upper income families, more damaging than having to eat SpaghettiOs that you got from this food bank for a couple days until, oh, I'll get another job, it'll be okay.
How widespread is the problem, not only among low income, but across the board?
Something like 15 million children in the U.S. experience, 0 to 5, so young children, experience food insecurity in any given year. It's a little bit more concentrated, again, among low-income households, so about 20% of low-income young children are food insecure, whereas the number's lower among all households.
Tell me a little bit about your research now. What were you and your colleagues looking to find out? And tell me what you and your colleagues looked at.
There have been, a number of studies that have kind of connected food insecurity among older children to things like behavior problems, some, kind of basic kind of tests, reading tests, math test score outcomes, all negatively. And then there have been a kind of a smattering of studies that have looked at like health outcomes, like food insecurity and links to obesity among children of all age groups. But there have been no studies that looked at food insecurity and its links to cognitive and social emotional outcomes among young children across the first 5 years of life. And we know from a separate body of research that the first 5 years of life are critical in terms of laying the foundation for later development. So, nutritional inadequacy and low, parenting quality or disrupted parenting quality, and any other kind of negative thing you can think of that goes along with poverty or other stress that happens in the first 5 years of life is expected to be more disruptive than something that happens later, because there's so much foundational kind of brain architecture and development that's happening at that time. So the fact that nobody had looked at these first 5 years, when we know development is so important and unfolding so rapidly and critically, no one had looked at the impact of food insecurity on those outcomes during those first 5 years seemed like a kind of an obvious and pressing question. So we wanted to focus in on that and really investigate carefully what is the impact, if there is one, of food insecurity at 9 months, so something in infancy, at 2 years, so some point of toddlerhood, and then at, in preschool, so around age 4, food insecurity at those distinct time points, and then cumulatively together on children's readiness for school when they walk through the kindergarten door.
How did you go about looking at that?
We used a nationally representative data set that's collected, has been collected by the Federal Department of Education. It's called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Birth Cohort. So it's a cohort of children born in the US in 2001. And it followed those children when they were 9 months old in 2001, when they were 2 years old in 2003, when they were 4 years old in 2005, and then when they were in kindergarten in 2006, 2007. So it's really the best data set to look at those key developmental periods when we know this kind of growth is happening more and more rapidly and importantly. Because it's nationally representative, it has a sufficient subsample of low-income families where I said food insecurity is more concentrated. Also, they collected the full food insecurity scale, which is an 18-item measure that the U.S. Department of Agriculture developed, and that's considered kind of the gold standard for measuring food insecurity. So it's a parent-reported set of 18 items about food insecurity.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
There are 18 items that make up a household food insecurity scale, and then those are 10 of the items, and then 8 of them are specifically about children. So if you're a household without children, you don't get asked those 8 items. In our case, these are all households with young children, so they got asked all 18 items. And it's parent response to things that cover the experience of not having enough food. So, was there ever a time in the last year that you had to go to sleep hungry? So like the physical experience of hunger, but also anxiety about not having enough food. So did you worry that you wouldn't have enough food? Or was there a time when you were worried you wouldn't be able to provide food for your children? So it kind of measures the physical and psychological dimensions of food insecurity. And is considered to be kind of pretty valid and widely used.
What did researchers find?
What we found was that food insecurity experienced, as defined by parent responses to these 18 items that I just talked about, food insecurity of the moderate or severe levels experienced when children were infants, so around 9 months old, exacted negative effects on their cognitive and social emotional outcomes 5 years later when they were in kindergarten. Even after controlling for a bunch of other things that we think might bias that association. So, we know that food insecure families are systematically different than families who aren't food insecure in ways that are probably also associated with their children's school readiness outcomes. So we kind of controlled for that, which means statistically partialing out the independent effects of those other variables. So as best as we could, looking just at or isolating the association between food insecurity at 9 months and kindergarten capacities, and still found a very strong or robust link. Same thing for 2 years old. So when children were 2 years old, if they experienced food insecurity at a moderate or severe level relative to no food insecurity, they had lower cognitive scores and poorer behavioral outcomes 4 years later in kindergarten.
The children that were shown to have the food insecurity, what kind of impacts, what kind of behaviors were you seeing?
We stay away from causal language in my world. Again, kind of the point of my policy background was to equip me with the methods that policymakers use to evaluate policies. And when someone evaluates a policy, they want to know, does it work? And the only way you can know if it works is to be sure you're focusing just on that one thing, right? So in psychology, it's very hard to do that because particularly with secondary observational data, we haven't randomly assigned anyone to be food insecure versus not. So we can't kind of say that these things are randomly assigned or they occur randomly. We have to accept the fact that parents who are food insecure may be, on average, more disorganized. They may have more mental health challenges. They may have substance abuse problems. They may be victims of domestic violence. There may be other things going on in the home that both make them more likely to be food insecure and also impede their children's development. So in the absence of random assignment and being able to deal with that, we can't say causally that food insecurity causes worse outcomes. What we can say is that sucking out all of those other effects, which we did statistically, we controlled for maternal depression and we controlled for poverty and we controlled for marital status and things like that. Controlling for all those items, it appears correlationally that food insecurity at these earlier time points in development, and to some extent, even as children approached kindergarten and preschool, had lower reading and math scores, increased behavior problems measured by measure reconstructed that we think taps hyperactivity and conduct problems. So pushing, tantruming, kind of acting out in class, and then reduced kind of approaches to learning, which is sitting still, paying attention.
You had mentioned the food insecurity was moderate or severe. How would you describe moderate or...
In this 18-item measure, more is worse, right? So if you endorse all 18 of those items, yes, I worry about not having enough food. Yes, I went to bed hungry. Yes, I put my kids to bed hungry. Yes, I skipped a meal because I didn't have enough food. If you say yes to all those things, that's severe food insecurity. The USDA has recommendations for if you say yes to 1 or 2 items, that's kind of mild. If you say yes to something, I can't tell you the numbers off the top of my head, but 7 to something items, it's moderate, and then severe would be the upper end of that spectrum.
What do these findings suggest to you?
That there are likely direct and indirect explanations for why food insecurity impacts children's development negatively. So the direct explanation would be something that we can't see, at least in this data set, which is there's something going on in the developing brain. There's actual nutritional deprivation that's making it hard for brains to develop to their maximum capacity because brains underlie all the things that we're measuring, self-regulation and cognitive skills and social emotional interactions, et cetera. There's also kind of the indirect effect, which is that food insecurity impacts parenting and the quality of the relationship between the parents and the children, which subsequently impacts the children's development. And that can also be a brain explanation. So parents are the key actors in stimulating children's early brain growth by playing with them and speaking to them sensitively and responsively and following them on their line of questioning and helping children think, learn, and grow. So if parents are distracted because they're hungry, or if they're distracted because they're worried about being hungry or worried about their child being hungry, then they're not going to engage in those activities probably as well or as consistently as a parent who doesn't have those stressors. So the brain explanation, and I think it's important to underscore, is something that could happen directly or indirectly. Either way, we think something's going on that, early development, which, arises from some brain process, neural developmental process, is not happening, is not being stimulated in these food insecure households.
What are the implications from these findings?
The implications are that we need to do a better job as a country in making sure that households with young children don't experience periods of time where they can't provide enough food. These are, of course, there's the outlier or the occasional case where there's a situation of substance abuse or something going on that if the parent were given money they wouldn't use it to buy food, but that's not at all the majority of cases or even close to that. So there are families who are really struggling to provide for their kids and make sure their kids have everything that they need and deserve to grow healthy and strong, and they are not able to do that given the kind of resource constraints of low-income families in this country. So there need to be better food assistance programs that are consistent and more generous and targeted towards households with young children, because that's when negative effects seem to be most strong, and it's most important that children are food secure.
Takeaways for parents, 3 key things that you would want them to remember?
Food insecurity can happen to families of all economic backgrounds, and that parents should be aware of programs that exist in their communities to help provide a food-oriented safety net. So local community food banks, libraries, public schools during the school year provide breakfast and lunch to school-age children. That's a little harder for the 0 to 5 group. So parents should ask their pediatricians to link to resources to increase the opportunity to get food for their kids who aren't in the school system. So I would say, to reach out to your community, to your, social service and healthcare providers, and see if people can link you to food programs.
Do you have one safety net in particular that you like people to know about? One place that they can go to start the search?
I mean, the WIC program is targeted towards mothers with young children, it isn't, unfortunately, generous enough to probably offset food insecurity for most of these families, but it's a place to start, and most pediatricians at the well child visit would be able to talk about that program. And some communities have kind of extension or add-on programs that would help make up for what the benefits don't provide.
And we're talking about food insecurity at very young ages, and then tracking the kids as they go into preschool. Mm-hmm. But over the long haul, what is your thought of what could happen? I
mean, it's hard to know because the word is food insecurity. We're not talking about hunger. So we're not talking about people who are persistently hungry necessarily, or they may be. It's just they don't know if they're going to have enough food, if there are going to be times where they're feeling hungry and times where they're not. There's going to be the provision of nutritionally inadequate food for a sustained period of time, which we think is probably not as good for health, physical health and development. So, I imagine the cumulative, what we noted in this study, which only covered the first 5 years, was that more food insecurity across more years was worse than less food insecurity across fewer years. So my assumption, if you kind of carry that out to its logical conclusion, is that would be true if it continued to age 10, even worse to age 12, even worse through puberty, when other biological, processes are enacted.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background, where you got your undergraduate degree, master's, and again your level of experience?
I did my undergraduate work at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, in Middletown, Connecticut, and there I studied psychology and government. I completed my undergraduate work there in 2002, took a couple years off, and then started my graduate work at Columbia University in New York, where I did a PhD in developmental psychology and a master's in public administration, which is a public policy degree, while I was there. So both of those graduate degrees are from Columbia.